let's give a round of applause for Tom. He talks about Interpretive Agency Narrative.
All right, thank you so much, Corey, for the introduction. It is awesome to be here. So narrative in video games is one of my deep passions. I think it is an endlessly fascinating subject because it is so new. And you think about video games and the history of things and how everything here is really only at the beginning. And I think we are born at just the right time to see an incredible evolution of narrative in video games. And so I'm so excited to be talking to you all today about just that. So as mentioned, my name is Tom Sharpe, and I am the director of Gossamer Games. And I do a little bit of everything. So I don't really specialize. It's an awesome picture, thank you. I don't really specialize in narrative development specifically. I bounce around a little bit between programming, to design, to art, to narrative. So I do a little bit of everything bouncing around. But narrative really is something that drives a lot of what we do at Gossamer Games. And so Gossamer Games is a brand new Philadelphia indie game studio focusing on exploring video games as an empathetic medium. So we're really interested in trying to capture these abstract thoughts and emotions through play. Normally, when you're talking about storytelling in video games, you're talking about very specific scripts, dialogue, and characters, and we're really interested in capturing some of those big thematic elements through action and through play and through atmosphere design. And we're trying to do that with our debut game, Soul. Soul is an abstract adventure game where you play as a tiny ball of light in a world shrouded in darkness. And in the game, you're wandering through this uninhabited environment, painting the land with light as you uncover its mysterious past. So you're exploring the remnants of great cities and discovering the history of an ancient civilization on your journey to restore life to this abandoned world. And as mentioned before, we do have a demo of this that you can play after the presentations and discussions here today. And we'd love to hear your feedback, still in development, but going to be releasing on Xbox One, hopefully later this year. And we're really inspired by a lot of the games that we're going to be talking about today, such as Journey and Shadow of the Colossus. So we would love to continue that discussion as we're going through the demos as well. So storytelling in video games. To call it hard is kind of an understatement. I would say it's almost impossible, and really why is that? It's strange because we've been telling stories for forever, right? Since the beginning of mankind, we've been telling stories through painting and writing and music. So why is it so hard to do this in video games if we've done it in so many other mediums? Well, let's get into that a little bit. And don't get me wrong, I mean, we're doing stories pretty well in video games, considering how early the medium is. Great games like The Walking Dead, The Stanley Parable, and The Last of Us are examples of how you can construct really rich thematic narrative elements through play and through video games. There are tons of interesting characters to explore, themes and ideas, and there are also tons of different ways of telling stories in video games, which I think is really the exciting part of this medium. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about this spectrum of player agency and how that affects the narrative. So what makes storytelling in video games hard is it all coming down to the player. And there are different ways of handling player agency in video games. I like to think about creating video games a little bit like writing or directing a play, a theater production, where you have the scenery and the props and the actors and the story, and all of it is very carefully designed for the audience. Except for one part of it, which is your protagonist is this random person who is just there on stage playing your protagonist. And they're improvising their way through, and maybe sometimes you're feeding them lines, so they kind of get beat to beat, but they really have no idea of what you're intending as the creator or as the artist. And so I do like to think of video games as a performance art, but not performance art by the creator or the artist, but performance art by the audience, which is a really, really interesting challenge, and one that I think is pretty unique to the medium of video games. So you can imagine why this might be really hard for creating narratives. A lot of people in the video game industry argue that player agency fights inherently with storytelling, So if you have a story, you have these beats you're trying to get to, opening it up for player choice and player decisions kind of fights against that, because you might have conflicting motivations from the player versus the creator. But video games have done a really good job of finding ways of approaching this, and there's a whole spectrum of narrative agency in games that we're going to look at really quickly here. So on one side, we have a game like The Last of Us, which many consider to be one of the best games for storytelling, one of the greatest examples of storytelling in modern video game design. And this is a game that focuses on the relationship between a handful of characters and watching their progression as they're moving through increasingly stressful and trying times and scenarios. And it's very carefully scripted. There isn't too much agency in the narrative. There isn't too much agency in the narrative progression or the structure. And it's primarily communicated through cutscenes and enhanced through gameplay. So dialogue between between characters can play out during impromptu moments within the gameplay. But the big portion of everything is communicated through carefully directed and planned cutscenes. And I would say overall, this method, while immersive and very good at communicating a story, has little narrative agency, because you're not really affecting the narrative in any real manner. On the other side of things, we have a game called Fortnite, which some of you may have heard of. It's one of the biggest games in the world right now. And the interesting thing is, a lot of people would say that this game has no narrative at all. There is no story at all in Fortnite. But I would argue that there actually is. I think it just tells it in a very different way. Fortnite isn't a game that is telling you a story about characters or the world or anything like that. It's a story between different players, and it happens spontaneously. So really what the developers have done is create a giant sandbox that allows for spontaneous interactions between players. They set up all these systems to try and create behaviors and conflict between players, and that's where the stories emerge. So it's storytelling that isn't written, it emerges through interaction through other players. And so I would say on this end of the spectrum, it's kind of the opposite, where there are huge amounts of player agency in terms of what narrative is created, just depending on who you're playing with, your relationship to them, and what happens within the game. And then somewhere in the middle or on one side or the other of those things, we have games like The Walking Dead or Mass Effect or Fallout that employ branching narratives. And these are great because they give varying amounts of narrative agency, but they give the illusion of control to players while letting creators still tell their stories. So creators can go out and write these beautiful characters and have these amazing stories, but they also give an illusion of player agency that they can use to enhance the role-playing aspect of video games. And there's also kind of a different type of agency that games are starting to explore that I'm personally really, really interested and invested in. So throughout different art forms, we've seen art designed for interpretation, and creators using non-literal language to communicate something that requires the audience to fill in the gaps or to insert their own interpretation of the art. And I think the easy example of this is something like poetry, which is carefully designed to use interpretive language that encourages readers to draw out their own meaning from the piece of work. And we also have this in film and music and tons of other mediums as well. And what I'm really excited about is I really believe that video games are starting to employ some of these methods as well. So about 10 years ago, indie games really started to explode through programs like the Xbox Live Arcade and the PlayStation Network, because it allowed developers to put out creatively riskier projects in front of a very large audience. And paired with tools like Unity and Unreal, more independent video game developers could start making these more experimental projects and exploring different ways of telling narratives in games. So a great example of this is Journey, which is a game that drops you into the middle of this desert, and you're wandering through and taking in the sights and the sounds, and trying to learn more about the history of the world around you, along with your protagonist and following their journey. The creators have talked at length about how the game was pretty much a direct interpretation or direct translation of Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. And so it's meant to be this universally accessible piece of work that players bring their own interpretation into, and how they can start finding meaning in this kind of abstract sequence. And also serves as a huge inspiration for our games as well. And so I call this interpretive agency because it's not explicit agency in storytelling where you have the decision to influence the path the narrative progresses, but it's how you're taking in and responding to the story. And I think this goes really well with what we would call traditional agency, such as making decisions in Mass Effect or The Walking Dead, because the player not only has control over their performance and how they're role-playing within the video game, but how they can also reflect upon the story that's being told to them and react to them at the same time. So it's like you're hearing a story at the same time and participating in the story at the same time. And I think this type of agency works really well in the medium of video games, because it allows creators to touch on the themes that they want to touch upon and to wander through the stories they want to tell and the different thematic elements, while still leaving players to maintain a sense of agency and participation in the narrative. And it also is an interesting way of trying to avoid things like this, where you have maybe a more serious story that can kind of get dismantled with any bugs or any unintended consequences, like the player standing on a table for 10 minutes when they're supposed to be running away from danger, right? So some of that dissonance can be mitigated by having a more abstract approach to the narrative design and letting players fill in their gap, because in turn, that would influence how they're progressing and performing in the actual game. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily the best method for storytelling in video games. That's kind of the awesome part about all of this, is we're really only at the beginning, and we're starting to see games branch off into a bunch of different aspects. And I, again, like to think of video games as performing arts, where you go to the theater and you can go and see an opera, or a one-man show, or a musical, or an ensemble theater production. And they're all kind of different experiences, right? But they all fall within this realm of performance art. And I think with video games, we're kind of in that same area, where we have video games that are going to be these massive online multiplayer games that have all these user interactions between different players. We have single-player experiences that you're getting told a linear narrative. We have branching narratives that employ a lot of player agency in the narrative. So there are all these different branches, and I don't think any one of them does a better job at telling a story. I think it's just the different ways in which we're starting to employ these different methods. And it's incredible. You look at where video games were even 20 years ago, right? And we've come so far, and just from a technology perspective and from a design perspective. The types and the varieties of games that we're getting are incredible today. And so, in conclusion, I think we're really only at the beginning of exploring these types of narrative designs in video games. And I think really, if you're interested in telling stories, video games is the most exciting medium of this generation. Thank you.